Welcome to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio, sponsored by EarthX, the world's largest environmental experience, and also sponsored by Natural Awakenings magazine. Live your healthiest life on a healthier planet. Now, here's your host, Bernice Butler.
Welcome to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio today. We're now nearing the end of our second season, but still more excited than ever to continue to help you explore and understand the unbreakable relationship between your health and the health of the planet. We look at the hottest topics related to our environment and its sustainability and how they affect your health and wellness. Here, issues like climate change, plastic pollution, extreme weather events, and others will meet up with everyday impacts like allergies and asthma, digestive issues and gut health, cancers, lung, heart issues, and more. So listen in today as we interview experts for today's show in our series on cities, built environment, and infrastructure coexisting with our health and well-being. And today's show specifically, we're going to talk about the built environment effects on the natural environment, wildlife, and climate change. The built and natural environment and health are inextricably connected. Decisions about how and where we build our communities have significant impacts on the natural environment and on human health. Patterns of development, patterns of transportation, infrastructure, and building location and design, which of course is the definition of the built environment, they directly affect the natural environment. Development takes the place of natural ecosystems and it fragments habitat. That is, where and how the living things live and go about their daily being. It also influences decisions people make about how to get around and determines how much people must travel to meet our daily needs. Now, these mobility and travel decisions then have indirect effects on our human health as well as the natural environment by affecting air and water pollution levels. They affect the global climate. They affect levels of physical activity, community engagement, as well as affecting the number and the severity of vehicle crashes. Trends in land use, building patterns, and travel behavior highlight just how significantly development patterns have changed in recent decades and how they are growing in importance. The size of virtually every major metropolitan area in the United States has expanded dramatically in recent years. In many places, even, the rate of land development has far outpaced the rate of population growth. Although more recent trends in some areas suggest that the pattern could be changing. As the amount of developed land has increased and the amount of land yet to be developed has decreased, and larger homes have been built, and buildings, roads, and associated impervious surfaces have grown to serve an increasingly diverse population, we see more and more issues. As our communities changed to accommodate cars, the percentages of people taking public transit, walking, and bicycling has declined, even though there are many, many efforts to try to turn that around. Projected population growth and demographic trends suggest that the need for additional development will continue to increase. As the U.S. and global population has grown, we develop land that serves or that has served important ecological functions at a significant cost to the environment. And in addition to fragmenting these habitats, development has also destroyed and degraded habitats. In facing our greatest challenges, researchers have been questioning where are the wild things going to reside in the future? And these large carnivores, which of course are animals such as bobcats, hawks, mountain lions, foxes, wolverines, coyotes, eagles, and many, many more, have been the primary focus of this area of question. An exploration of the built environment can help inform our understandings of reactionary conservation's limits. Proactive species conservation is certainly ideal. However, conservation generally occurs when species populations are already in trouble and in critical states. That leads to the necessity for recovery requiring substantial resources to accomplish. The implications for species of our greatest concerns are clear, as the built environment sustains many of them. That dependency is likely to grow. Conservation-reliant species, which Kevin can talk to us more about, also come to mind because over 80% of species listed under the United States Endangered Species Act have been labeled as conservation-reliant. And the threats that they face can only be managed by humans and not eliminated. This is a lot. And as we see, how and where we do build affects natural environment and human health in many, many ways. And here to help us unpack some of this is Kevin Taylor with the World Wildlife Fund. Kevin heads the city's initiative as part of the climate program at the World Wildlife Fund. His work advances climate change directly in cities, as well as supports the role of local governments in the United States, nationally, and international climate policy. This includes the areas of renewable energy, resilience, measurement and reporting, and the engagement of civil society. Kevin serves as the U.S. Program Director for the World Wildlife Fund's One Planet City Challenge, and he is a lead expert on cities in the World Wildlife Fund's global network. Since 2017, Kevin has worked on the core team managing one of the World Wildlife Fund's signature programs, which is We Are Still In, and it's now called America is All In. And prior to joining the World Wildlife Fund, which I will begin to call the WWF, Kevin spent 3 years as a land and environmental planner with CDM Smith. Kevin holds a master's degree in urban planning and an environmental management degree from Duke University. Welcome, Kevin. We are so glad that you could join us. And did I get all of that right?
Thank you, Bernice. Yes, it's great to be with you. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you. We're just excited you could be with us. You guys were with us last year as we talked about wildlife and the effect. We had Nikhil Advanti, and it just made us realize what just a superb resource you are to this show, but to the whole environmental movement in general. So start us out, Kevin, before we get into some of the meat and potatoes of what we want to talk about. Tell us more about the World Wildlife Fund. How long have you been around? What was the impetus for you all getting started?
Sure. So, and we're actually just coming off of our 60th anniversary last month. So we're founded in 1951. And that initial impetus was, as our iconic panda logo suggests, it was around species conservation, protecting species and their habitat. Over that 60-year history, our mission and breadth of issues that we touch on has grown significantly. So we are obviously all associated with species conservation, but we also work, as indicated in my role here, on climate change, on freshwater, oceans, forests, food. And so we really touch a lot of different areas of conservation, reflecting the need to do so in tackling these complex problems. We have a network now that has a presence in over 100 countries, millions of supporters around the world as well that help drive our mission and engage with us on doing the advocacy and work on the ground in all those different places where we work.
Indeed. Back when you all got started 60 years ago, was there one particular or a couple of particular species that made your antenna go up and blink off and on, or just across the board you saw species in danger?
It was across the board. I think in some particular key areas in Asia where the scientists at that time were working, and the sort of origin of the panda as our logo really, speaks to that work. It initially started with those species that are, keystone species, as we say, in the environment, in the ecosystems, recognizing their unique place and also their ability to connect with people, right? People, these sort of iconic megafauna, as they're called, tigers, pandas, elephants, they resonate with with the average person and the public. But they're also symbolic of the ecosystems in which they live and key to their survival. So that was the part of the impetus around the early work of the organization, focusing on some of those key species.
You mentioned keystone species. What's your definition of this keystone species, and why do you call them so?
Yes, well, it's a kind of term of art in ecology where scientists identify, those species often at the upper ends of the food chain that are sort of key to the functioning and health of the ecosystem. So if you have this species in place and it's healthy, then it suggests that a lot of the other species that it depends on for food and then on down the line are also healthy. So they serve as a proxy for the health of an overall ecosystem, the population and health of species like I mentioned, tigers, elephants, pandas, and many others, polar bears that many people are familiar with.
We're going to go to break, but we're going to talk some more about the keystone species when we come back. I think that's very interesting, and I think it's important that people understand that. We'll be right back on the other side of the break with Kevin Taylor with the World Wildlife Fund, WWF, and not the other one. Thank you for being with us, Kevin. We want to give a shout out now to our sponsors. That is Natural Awakenings, Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex Magazine, the Green, Healthy, and Sustainable Living Authority, former DFW Metroplex, and North Texas communities. Print issues of Natural Awakenings can be found in all Whole Foods markets, natural grocers, Central Markets, Sunflower Shops, and many, many other locations, as well as available free for download online at nadallas.com. Check them out. Our other sponsor is North Haven Gardens, serving the Metroplex since 1951, the most respected horticultural establishment in North Texas, offering gardening and plant education, concierge services, DIY classes, gifts, and more. Check them out at nhg.com. And our other sponsor is Lynn Dental Care, practicing dentistry for over 38 years with a holistic approach looking at the whole body and none mercury. Specializing in periodontics, Dr. Lynn is board certified by the International Academy of Oral Medicine and Toxicology. Check them out at lindentalcare.com. Thank you, sponsors. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio. To today's show on the built environment, effects on the natural environment, wildlife, and climate change. And we are back with Kevin Taylor with the WWF, as in World Wildlife Fund, not the other one. Again, thank you for being with us, Kevin. And right before the break, you were talking about keystone species, which has kind of got me going. It's very interesting, and I think it's important that people understand it. And you were explaining to us how that is kind of the foundational or the bedrock species, where if they exist, then it allows for the other lesser or other species to exist. Right,
yeah. I mean, the metaphor comes from the keystone of an arch, right, where once you put that in, it's supporting the structural integrity of the entire system, in that case an arch, in this case the ecosystem writ large. So the keystone species is sometimes those megafauna like we were talking about before, polar bears, pandas, wolves, or apex predators, so the top predators in the food chain. Mm-hmm. There are also keystone species that are plants or that are other types of species, but the key definition here, key criteria is that they are described as being central to the healthy functioning of that ecosystem. If you take them out, then the entire ecosystem could fail. That's very interesting, and it helps really us to build on some of the other things I want to ask you. It certainly helps me to understand it. But one more question before I leave Keystone. As you see, I'm really focused in on that. I hear you saying there's not a definitive list. You cannot say everywhere in the world. I guess it's depending on geography. For example, in my mind, I'm wondering, is the lion at the top of that, and then below the lion is the tiger, and below the tiger is the elephant? Does any such thing like that exist? How is it defined or modeled? Yeah, not that I'm aware of, and I would caveat it by saying I'm by no means a wildlife expert, but it is highly specific to the particular ecosystem. As you know, as you were setting up in the intro here to the show, is that they are very intricately linked to the place and evolved in that way. And so, yeah, it differs place to place.
Would we be able to, if we were interested, to say, I'm probably the top Googler in the U.S., but could I go and Google what are the keystone species for North Texas or the American Southwest?
Yeah, specific geographies or landscapes in mind that there's, scientists have studied those areas and identified what some of the key species would be, certainly.
Totally exciting and interesting because it helps to build on our understanding of my question and the reason for being for Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio, and that is, why should people care about this stuff? And we'll come back and reconnect with that a little bit. Another question based upon your description of WWF, which I think also adds to our understanding, was how you all initially started. The impetus was on conserving species, of course, our cuddly panda included. And then you ventured out into many other areas of conservation. Why did that happen? I think I understand it. You kind of had to.
Well, certainly. I mean, it's a reflection of, again, the complexity of the system and nature, the natural world, the range and variety of threats that they face, and our interconnections as people with the planet as well, right? So it is better conservation practice to address these problems from a comprehensive perspective as much as you are able to. And when, for example, we touch on a lot of different areas as WWF, but we don't have expertise in every place. So we then go out and find the partners who have that expertise. Oftentimes they're folks on the ground in these places that know the landscapes even better. And so it is just what we've found to be effective conservation practice to try to address these issues from a range of strategies and tackle the threats because if you have sort of what they kind of knock-on effects of things like climate change, if you're not addressing climate change or taking climate change into effect in your species conservation work, for example, then the historic range of a species is shifting due to a warming world. You might be protecting this one area that's their traditional historical habitat, but the climate changes and their range then moves that someplace else where you had all of this work in place to protect this area, but that's no longer habitable by that species.
I would venture to say that you can't really do your job or focus on your mission of conservation without taking all these other things into consideration. As the focus of our show is, the interconnection is inextricable. You cannot conserve species without being concerned about all the other. And we're glad that you are doing this. So, Kevin, moving on, though, let's talk about how does our built environment affect and threaten our natural environment and wildlife? How does that happen? And does all built or man-made things affect nature and wildlife the same? Talk to us about that.
Yes, well, this is one other example of where our work has grown and evolved over the years. So I joined WWF about 10 years ago and came in to work on a project that at that time was brand new called the One Planet City Challenge, we mentioned earlier. It was at that point a new area of work for WWF in further exploring and drawing these connections between the built environment, cities in this case, and nature and our conservation mission, recognizing the role that cities play both in being sources of problems like emissions of greenhouse gases or development of land from natural areas to built areas and human settlements, but also being sources of solutions to those problems, right? So it's clear that if we are to have a sustainable society and civilization on this planet, our environment needs to needs to balance and work together with the natural environment. And so cities have got to be that solution space as well, and many of them are taking that leadership role.
Indeed. 60 years ago, I have to think, when WWF got started, cities were not perhaps as intrusive on the natural environment and the natural habitats. And so now it's kind of like we talked earlier. It's a must to take them into consideration. And of course, cities are the primary, certainly not the sole, but cities are the primary location of the built environment.
Yes, in many ways, certainly. Back 50, 60 years ago, the majority of people on this planet didn't live in cities. Now, over 50% of the world lives in cities. By mid-century, by 2050, that's projected to increase to 70%. And so it is increasingly where people are living, which when we talk about the built environment and its impacts, from my background in urban planning, we often speak to the virtues of having compact and dense
and walkable.
And walkable, because a lot of the systems that unlocks, as opposed to a sprawling development pattern built on the automobile. So it's, in one way, is encouraging that more people are moving to cities, but we've got to make sure, again, that those cities are operating in a way that's allowing the types of lifestyles for not only the planet and the resources those cities consume to be sustainable, but healthy and livable for the people in them, right? So we speak, as WWF, we speak as much to the needs of people as we do to the needs of the planet, because, again, they are so inextricably linked, and is our conservation mission to speak to and support a future in which people and nature thrive.
Indeed. Well, if one of the other's gone, then who or whatever's left cannot thrive. Now, Kevin, are there certain types of development patterns or building patterns that are more harmful than others? I was going to say helpful also. You've already mentioned what I like to call the new urbanist community, walkable communities. But are there certain types that are more helpful or harmful than others?
Absolutely. I mean, it's both in what we build, how we build it, and how we sustain those systems. So what we build is increasingly looking towards what we call nature-based solutions to problems. So using the existing services and functions that nature provides, like flood protection of things like wetlands and mangrove forests, as opposed to building seawalls or what's called gray infrastructure. It's how we build those things and where. So we talked about the development patterns of trying to use less area per square foot for cities to get more in a smaller area, so we're not taking over natural areas to a degree that's unnecessary.
So you're saying more compact. Does that mean taller, higher?
It certainly has meant that, right? And if you look at the history of cities, they have, from a variety of factors, mostly a lot of economic factors, built up as opposed to out. Certainly in the developed world, that has been the practice over the last 50 years.
Indeed, and I have to think there's some issues with that, too. We're going to go to break now, and we'll be right back on the other side of the break to continue this very interesting discussion with Kevin Taylor, who is with the World Wildlife Fund, and he's making us all much smarter. Thank you, Kevin. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio. Today to our show on cities, built environment, and infrastructure coexisting with health and well-being. We are back today with Kevin Taylor, who is with the World Wildlife Fund, and he's talking to us about built environment effects on the natural environment, wildlife, and climate change. Welcome back, Kevin. Again, we're so glad that you could join us.
Thank you.
Kevin, before we went to the break, we were talking about the effects of the built environment and if there were any patterns that were better or worse. And I keyed in on some of your statements about what you call gray infrastructure, which I'm assuming is that what I would call public works infrastructure?
Often, yeah. I mean, that's typically what people think of. There are traditional practices of managing, runoff from roads and bridges or seawalls. The term comes from a reference to concrete, right? We use concrete in a lot of that. It's gray.
So would you say, or do you think that type of building pattern or those type of structures or that element of the built environment is perhaps more detrimental than others?
It is shifting, certainly. So what we're finding is, and cities are finding, is that while those systems can serve sort of key functions and can address the very specific problems they are designed for, in a changing climate, the limits of that infrastructure becomes more apparent. And using things like green infrastructure, so using natural landscapes or nature-based solutions, like I mentioned a few before, can serve that key function of whether it's flood protection, reducing the urban heat island effect, which is cities being hotter because of all of the paved surfaces and things. They can serve a variety of benefits that traditional gray infrastructure can't serve. So you get more bang for your buck and more resilient cities built on those types of solutions than some of the historical practices.
Is that like in South Florida, we had a number of new urbanist communities, and one of the things they would do in South Florida, because you always had to have retention ponds everywhere, was that they would make the retention pond into this really nice, cute garden-like thing with rocks and native plants and things like that, where you wouldn't really know what it was unless you were into building, construction, and planning.
In part, but I think, the need for retention ponds is largely because of all of the impervious surfaces that are around, right? Water is collecting and doesn't have as much area, natural areas to seep through as it normally would. So you need those to collect it in a place where you can know where it's going as opposed to wherever, and then you have flooding. So it is in part that, but you would use other green infrastructure techniques or nature-based solutions to reduce the area of impervious surfaces or reduce the flooding risk so that you don't need those retention ponds to quite the degree. Having more, as we talked about earlier, so the footprint of cities, having them be a bit more compact, you have more than open space, which helps address things like flooding, but it also, people need green spaces. It's been shown that having access to green spaces not only promotes physical health and better air quality, but also mental health. Having that access to green areas, parks, et cetera, of many different sizes has been shown to improve the mental health and health of residents in those areas.
I have to believe, I know that there's an economic trade-off as well. I know in the city of Austin, where I have done development, it's my home. When you build, there's a code overlay that specifies the percentage of impervious cover that you can have. And I know that building and permitting in Austin is a mini nightmare. So I know that there are those trade-offs. Let me ask you this too, Kevin. What would you consider to be the greatest threats in terms of impact for our species?
To me, I've chosen to work focus quite heavily on climate change over these last several years in my career, and I think it's widely recognized that a warming climate, global warming, climate change, the climate crisis, it goes by many things we've referred to as is an existential threat if it is not abated. If we take no action to reduce our emissions of greenhouse gases, warming gases in the atmosphere, not only our species, but most every other species on this planet will be severely impacted. So that's, where I've chosen to focus, and I think is, one issue that, again, when we're talking about how things are connected, what what touches virtually every area of conservation, virtually every species and ecosystem on the planet. The climate that our planet evolved into and how it exists now is key to that sort of continued functioning of the world as we see it today.
Just the other day, I saw the commercial on television with the polar bears and the melting ice. And I think that gives a sense, and it's trying to raise awareness of climate change and global warming and what it's doing to our species.
Certainly, yeah, certainly so, and certainly WWF as an organization that has a voice speaking to particularly issues of species conservation, those images resonate with a lot of people. What we've also found, however, though, is that sometimes that can feel far off or not connected to some people's everyday lives. So there may be a perception that climate change is only going to affect the Arctic, or it's only going to affect other species, not us. Thankfully, through a lot of awareness building and science and research and communications, that has been shown, and people are starting to see, more of the direct impacts and threats to their everyday lives in places like Texas. Of course, some of those more larger ways of these dramatic weather events, but there are also, less dramatic things that are happening slowly that we need to pay attention to as well, so that people are starting to see more of their stake and what is at stake with a warming climate and why we need to take action to address that and the benefits that can come from the solutions that we implement to reduce carbon pollution. It's not just avoiding bad things, but it is actually enabling economic development, the next sort of industrial revolution that's been talked about, the way we power our cities and our economies with clean energy and creating new jobs and all of those benefits that can come from this task of tackling climate change that are really powerful, and I think are going to make for quite a lot of benefits to public health, to our economy, and a number of other ways.
Why should people care? And this is part of how we like to say connecting the dots. Why should people care? How does that picture of the ice melting and the polar bears having no place to go, how does that affect us here in Texas? And why should we care about that?
Well, it's drawing the linkages between what is causing that melting ice, what is causing the impacts on those polar bear populations. Those same forces are going to be affecting us more and more, and already have been, right? So that's why we care. You may not, as an individual, be worried about or thinking about polar bears and their habitat, but if the same thing that is harming their environment is harming your environment, as it is with climate and air pollution and these issues, then that's where you find the common stake. And we're starting to see more and more people make those connections, express their desire to see lifestyles change, to make changes in their own lifestyles. So WWF just this week published a report on what sort of calling this eco-awakening, which is trends of the general public recognizing the importance of these conservation efforts, the needs to address these issues more and more. So there are a lot of encouraging trends that we're seeing from data about people who post on social media about these issues, on the importance of biodiversity and nature loss, or have increased some 65% since 2016 only. So people on using social media to express their concerns, take action, make their voices heard, is increasing because the impacts are becoming more and more visible. We also, the main program that I work on here, America is All In, is a manifestation of this awareness and caring for a variety of dimensions of this climate problem. So we have a coalition of some 5,000 plus institutions that are represented by cities, state governments, businesses, large and small, faith communities, public health and healthcare, colleges and universities that see the impacts on their own operations, see the impacts on how they do business, how they serve public health, how they educate students, how they build, and want to increasingly work together to find solutions to these problems and working with the national government as well here in the U.S. to address these challenges, because they're hearing from their customers, they're hearing from their residents, they're hearing from their students as well, that are helping to drive this and raising ambition, taking more action to address climate.
Indeed, it's good to know and to hear that the voices that are rising up are being heard. We're with Kevin Taylor with the World Wildlife Fund, and we'll be right back with him on the other side of the break. Thank you, Kevin. We want to give a shout out now to our sponsors. That is Natural Awakenings, Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex Magazine, the Green, Healthy, and Sustainable Living Authority for the DFW Metroplex and North Texas communities. Print issues of Natural Awakenings can be found in all Whole Foods markets, natural grocers, Central Market, sunflower shops, and many, many other locations, as well as available free for download online at nadallas.com. Our other sponsor is North Haven Gardens, serving the Metroplex since 1951, the most respected horticultural establishment in North Texas, offering gardening and plant education, concierge services, DIY classes, gifts, and more. Check them out at nhg.com. Our other sponsors, Lynn Dental Care, practicing dentistry for over 38 years with a holistic approach, none mercury, and looking at the whole body. Specializing in periodontics, Dr. Lynn is board certified by the International Academy of Oral Medicine and Toxicology. Check them out at lindentalcare.com. Thank you, sponsors. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio. We are back with Kevin Taylor with the World Wildlife Fund for today's show on the built environment, effects on the natural environment, wildlife, and climate change. As we've been talking, how and where we build affects the natural environment and human health in many ways, all the way from habitat and ecosystems to public health. And Kevin has really been helping us to understand this. So thank you, Kevin. I want to start this segment with moving to human health and well-being. And we talked about a number of threats of the built environment to our wildlife and nature, but I want to talk more about how and why do these impacts or intrusions of the built environment on nature and wildlife, how do they affect or intersect with human health and well-being? Tell us about some of the ways that wildlife facilitates health or perhaps impacts disease spread or maybe even impacts disease control. Talk to us about that.
Sure, I can say a little bit, although, again, I'll say there are other colleagues here that we have to really study these issues very deeply and have been, especially since the kind of onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, and looking at the origins of that and the relationship that we've already had a lot of deep understanding about the connections between the spread of diseases that we refer to as zoonotic diseases, those that originate in other animal species and jump to humans, and how that spread is exacerbated by more and more interaction between humans and these species, which, as we've been discussing, comes about from our development patterns and going into ecosystems where, we may not have had a footprint before, or destroying habitats of species that then force them into more interaction with us. So they have nowhere else to go but kind of being in our human settlements and on the fringes of human settled areas. One of the other points on this I think that is important too is so speaking again to the issue of climate change. And I mentioned earlier, how a warming climate is affecting the range of some of these species and the habitable areas that they have. For example, we know from West Nile virus, particularly, directly impacted by climate change because it influences the geographic range of that disease vector, which is mosquito. Mosquitoes are able to travel and reproduce and live in more areas, which puts more populations of people at risk. And so climate is another major consideration here when we're talking about public health and a relationship between public health risks of zoonotic diseases and the spread of diseases.
Indeed, and you brought forth a good point, because the West Nile virus is something that we are affected a lot by here in North Texas and have been for the last 2 years. What would be, I think, very beneficial is that as it's talked about, that it is clearly articulated and clearly made known that it is driven or has been impacted by climate change. And that would help people to begin to internalize the need to care about this, as well as the fact that it does affect us. It is a kitchen table issue. The other thing I want to ask you about, I hear a lot about, is bats. I've heard a number of times in some conversations that bats have caused certain diseases. They seem to be, are they a big carrier, or why are they always in the conversation with diseases?
Again, I wouldn't know the specifics on them. They do have interactions with people because they are able to live in habitats that are in cities or in settled areas. So it just by a function of having more interaction with people in those ways, and they are another mammalian species. So some of the similar diseases that affect them as mammals can affect us as mammals, and that's just at a very surface level is sort of where my familiarity with some of that for that particular species, or the multiple species of bats.
Indeed, and that makes sense because they come in contact with us more, and that's the whole ball of wax. Because I have to think, or you tell me, that as the climate warms, then as you said too, just that warmth may be driving various wildlife to different areas. Maybe the warming, is there any instance when the warming climate may be driving them closer to cities, closest to humans for some reason?
Well, it just comes back to what areas do they have in their ecosystem, and are their core needs of food, shelter being compromised by habitat loss, either from human settlement or from climate change that is, allowing a tree species to not exist in that area anymore. They've got the species that can travel are going to travel to where they can find food. We were talking about the polar bears earlier. There have been increasing numbers of interaction between polar bears and people in the Arctic because they have less ice to travel across, and they have less access to food. They need that ice cover in order to hunt. So when they can't hunt or they can't travel as freely, they're going to go, get in the garbage of a town or a city up there. So certainly climate change impacts the core function of these ecosystems, which drives species to go and try to find what they need in order to survive.
Indeed. And one last question on species, and then before we end, I want to talk about some of your work you're doing with cities, because you made a point up there that I want to dig into, and that is that cities can be the sources of solutions. But before we go to that, I want to talk just a minute. I want to try to, if we can, connect the dots about, are there any species without which humans would be at risk, or perhaps without that species, certain diseases would proliferate, or without that species, there's some food we wouldn't have, or something like that? Is there any connection there that you can think of or that you might know of?
A couple of examples, again, just kind of touching at the surface of, and would welcome your audience and listeners to take a look around the WWF website, and we've got a lot of great information there and other experts and colleagues that can speak to these in a lot of detail. But, we're talking about bats. While they can be a disease vector, they also eat a lot of mosquitoes and bugs that otherwise would, those populations, they keep one another in check. There's been a lot of press and investigation of the role that bees play, and some of the both their role as pollinators in helping to make the food systems we will rely on function, where we would be without pollinators in trying to serve the role that they serve, and then the collapse of some of those bee populations as well, connected to human activities. I would say too, though, it like the sort of the keystone species conversation, it depends on the context. There's a lot of different environments and ecosystems where diverse species interact, and the things that people need from those environments differ as well. And so it's a complicated system where understanding of the particulars of those places is key.
It is going to be regional and geographic, and I think that's important too. We just have a couple of minutes left, so I want you to tell us more about the Planet City Challenge. And again, you said cities can be the sources of solution. Talk to us about that briefly. And then before you go, tell us what ordinary people in their everyday lives can do to help drive solutions.
Yeah, I think those two are very well connected. So the One Planet City Challenge, WWF has been running this program for the last 10 years. In about 50 different countries. We've had hundreds of cities participate. It's a friendly competition where cities sort of share what they're doing to address climate change. And we sort of look at those programs and recognize outstanding examples every year to help spread good ideas, to help reinforce with positive messages to encourage cities to do more. And it's alongside that, we run a public engagement campaign called We Love Cities that encourages people to share what they love about their city that helps make it green and sustainable, and what they want to see more of from their city. So a lot of your listeners probably live in a city or a town, so can connect with their local leaders. And we see often the connection between local elected officials and their residents being a much more profound place where people can have direct impact as opposed to the national government or large areas. So get involved in your local community. Encourage your city to look at these examples. Again, the WWF website, One Planet City Challenge, has some great examples that folks can encourage their city to take on.
Engage and show your people who make the laws that you care. Thank you so much, Kevin. We really appreciate the information you've given us, made us smarter, and we now hopefully appreciate wildlife a little bit more, and certainly understand its unbreakable relationship to the planet and, of course, our health. Thank you. We've been with Kevin Taylor with the World Wildlife Fund. Thank you, Kevin.
My pleasure. Thank you, Brittany.
And thank you for listening today to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio. The conversation starts here, but our goal is for it to continue in your home, in your social circles, your workplaces, at the water cooler, and in the grocery checkout line, so that we can all work together to realize that healthy living is simply not possible without a healthy planet. Our culture is a result of 1 trillion tiny acts taken by billions of people every day like yourselves. And each of those tiny acts can seem insignificant, but they all add up, one way or the other, to the change that we each live through. This is your host, Bernice Butler. Thank you for listening today, and join us again next week for our last show on the built environment infrastructure, its intersection with our health and well-being. Thank you.